All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We'll get started while other folks trickle in. I'm Joel Dodge and I'm chair of the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter, and we are thrilled to present today's discussion, the state of the climate change fight in New York and beyond, along with fellow lawyer chapters across the country who agreed to co-sponsor today's event with us. I particularly wanted to single out the Bay Area Lawyer Chapter. If you are tuning in from the Bay Area, your ACS Lawyer Chapter will be holding its annual gala on June 8th on this exact topic of climate change. You can learn more about the evening speakers and awards and register to attend on the ACS website, so do check that out. Okay, so to get started, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently warned with very high confidence, and I'm quoting, that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Climate change poses a dire challenge to the planet, and in recent years, both the state and federal governments have undertaken significant steps to reduce carbon emissions. Today, we're going to discuss the latest on what's going well in the fight against climate change and what challenges we still need to overcome, from electrifying everything to giving our buildings an eco-friendly overhaul to deploying clean energy and more. We are thrilled to have an exceptional lineup of panelists with us today to discuss all of this. Ben Furnas is the executive director of the Cornell University's 2030 project, and he's also the former director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability. Matt Eisenson is the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative Fellow with Columbia Law School's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. And Camille Panu is the Associate Clinical Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, focusing on just transition issues. We'll save time for your questions toward the end of the hour, so please submit them using the Zoom Q&A function at any time. And with that, let's get started. So just to start, many climate conversations get pretty dark right off the bat. So instead, I wanted to lead off by talking about what is going well in the climate fight right now. What are the biggest successes and sources of progress that we've seen, both in New York and nationally over the last few years? So Ben, let me start with you. And before we turn to that question, you've worked both inside and outside of government, both at the New York City Mayor's Office and now at Cornell. So maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself and the work you've been doing.
Sure. Thanks so much, Joel. And it's really nice to be here. Hello, everyone. So as Joel said, my name is Ben Furnas. And I recently served for 8 years in the New York City Mayor's Office, culminating as the director of the Office of Climate and Sustainability. And now I'm at Cornell University, leading a new university-wide climate research initiative we're calling the 2030 Project. And both inside government, when I spent a long amount of time working with city agencies and the city council, all the levers of the executive branch to try to figure out how to reduce emissions from city government operations and help folks in New York City live more climate-friendly lives, reduce emissions associated from getting around, heating and cooling our buildings and our source of electricity and our waste. And now outside of government, working with Cornell, it's been really fun and thrilling actually to get to know the wide range of experts and scientists and researchers all across the Cornell community who are thinking about different aspects of solving or addressing climate change and working with them to amplify and support their great work. Just as Joel articulated, I think there is a little bit of good news right now. Obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act and the major federal climate legislation that passed just this past year has really changed the dynamics that I think cities and states have been grappling with for a long time. I think the story of my arc in the mayor's office was really figuring out all of the levers we had at our disposal and how we could be pulling them in order to take some action to reduce our emissions. New York City is a really big place, so we had some pretty large levers, but I think everybody knew in the back of their mind that this was a challenge the scale of which really needed federal action. And so that's part of why it's so heartening to really finally see the federal government and Congress and just the level of resources finally getting in the game. I thought I'd talk a little bit about two of the things I'm sort of most proud of during our time, my time in the mayor's office, just to sort of get us started. One, New York City is pretty distinctive in the United States because of the high quality of its transit system, which means that our emissions associated with transportation are actually quite low on a per capita basis. So a lot of the time we spent was really focused on the other major source of our emissions, which is the fossil fuels used to heat, cool, and power our buildings. So we spent a fair bit of time thinking about how to reduce emissions from existing buildings, encourage different types of retrofits, upgrades, and electrification, and then setting new standards on new buildings. And those sort of culminated in two major laws that we passed, one in 2019, Local Law 97, and one in 2021, the sort of All Electric Buildings Act for New York City. Local Law 97 set standards for very large buildings, 25,000 square feet and above. You can think of it as like a 25 apartment building, requiring them to meet progressively tighter emission targets over the next decade. So there's a targets that buildings will have to meet in 2024, just next year, and some deeper, more stringent targets that buildings will have to meet in 2030. The notion is to set sort of performance-based standards to spur retrofits. And there's a lot of political and logistical questions that I think, building owners and even current legislators are grappling with to making sure that those retrofits happen and that those shifts happen. During my time as executive or as director of the Office of Climate and Sustainability in 2021, we worked with the City Council to pass, what at the time was probably the most ambitious building electrification standard for new buildings in the United States. So we set a date certain after which all new buildings in the city of New York will have to be electric buildings or restrict on-site fossil fuel combustion. The sort of headline focus tends to be on gas stoves, but that's actually a fairly small portion of building energy use. The real win is to shift away from fossil fuel heat and hot water and towards electrified heat and hot water. And I think you've sort of seen enthusiasm for heat pump technology and electric heating that is getting better and better. And I think we really put a marker down that's what the next generation of buildings will look like. It was very exciting to see a sort of similar ambition pass through the state budget process this year, sort of taking that ambition statewide. The electrification of building heat is sort of helps you shift away from on-site fossil fuels towards whatever the energy source on your electric grid is. So it's sort of incumbent. The other half of this is to make sure that the electricity that we're generating is as clean as possible. The city didn't have a ton of levers to do this. A lot of this is state level decisions, but we did have, the power of our purchasing power. We're a huge consumer of electricity as a government. And so we were able to work closely with NYSERDA, which is the state energy agency in the state of New York, to help catalyze the development of two new transmission lines to bring upstate wind and solar and Canadian hydropower into the 5 boroughs. That was, something that made it across the finish line as a sort of contractual matter at the end of 2021, but we'll sort of see the completion of the construction of those two transmission lines probably 2025, 26, 27, and that will sort of really clean up the New York City sources of electricity. There was the closure of a nuclear power plant, which provided a ton of clean electricity to New York City, and so a lot of the decisions around the grid are sort of being made in the shadow of that decision. But I was very proud to see that we were able to catalyze the development of these big new pieces of infrastructure that's going to really clean up New York City's electricity grid. So those are the two items, and then looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Ben. Matt, I'll turn to you next. And before we talk about your views of what have been the biggest achievements on the climate front recently, I just wanted to ask about your work first. So you're at Columbia's Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative. And when we hear about other legal defense initiatives, some might be surprised that renewable energy even needs one. So maybe you could tell us why it does need one and what the work you're doing on that front looks like.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So I joined the Sabin Center just about a year ago after a little over 4 years at the New York Attorney General's office. And I lead the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative. And we have two main functions. There's a research side and a direct representation side. So on the research side, we research local opposition to renewable energy facilities and various obstacles and how to get around them. And then on the direct representation side, we will represent individuals, community groups, and sometimes small environmental groups who support individual wind and solar projects. The developers always have their own counsel, and we don't initiate lawsuits, but we'll intervene in citing proceedings in support of a project, and we'll submit amicus briefs. As to your question about why is this needed, renewable energy projects are frequently controversial in the communities where they're proposed. There have been hundreds of renewable energy projects that end up in court. The reasons for opposition are varied, but it's often visual impacts. People aren't used to looking at utility scale solar farms or utility scale wind farms. And I think that the opposition is sort of driven, why now as opposed to 10 years ago? Why was this initiative created in 2019, not 2009? I think it's really two reasons. One is that the economics, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, the economics for renewable energy have just gotten so much more favorable that developers want to build them in more places, and they're showing up in communities that haven't had these projects before. And the second is that there is organized opposition. The New York Times has had a lot of coverage recently about fossil fuel funding of some of the offshore wind litigation. If you look at the Vineyard Wind project, this is an 800 megawatt offshore wind project off of Martha's Vineyard. There are currently 4 NEPA lawsuits against it. They all talk about whale impacts, and none of them are brought by environmental groups. One is brought by a solar developer alleging competitive harms. Another is brought by a local group called Nantucket Residents Against Turbines. And then 2 of the lawsuits are brought by fishing industry groups. And again, they all focus on whale impacts. But one of the fishing industry groups, as the New York Times has documented, is getting free pro bono representation from the Texas Public Policy Institute, which is a fossil fuel funded institution. So, why do we have this initiative? Projects are being, contested in court. It's happened hundreds of times. The first time I read about it personally was Cape Wind, which was a, project that was in development from 2005 to 2017. The developer, Jim Gordon, spent $100 million of his own money trying to make it happen before having to give up. And the other thing is that at the local government level, hundreds of towns and counties have adopted restrictive ordinances that make it very difficult to cite these projects. These could be setbacks of saying, you can't build a single wind turbine within 3 miles of the nearest property line, which means that you essentially need a lot that's 6 miles by 6 miles or 36 square miles to build a single turbine. So that's why the initiative is needed. In terms of what I'm excited about, I think there have been 2 huge positive developments. One is, as I mentioned earlier, that the economics of wind and solar have improved so much. And unfortunately, I don't think that the lawyers really deserve any credit for this part. But just to throw out a couple figures, between 2009, the year that Obama was inaugurated, and 2021, when Biden was inaugurated, the lifetime levelized cost of solar fell 90%. In that same 12-year period, the levelized cost of wind fell 72%. These are the figures from Lazard, the investment bank. So 90% drop for solar, 72% drop for wind in this 12-year period. And utility scale solar went from like close to 0 in 2008 to close to 100 megawatts, 100 gigawatts. Sorry. So, just massive, massive increase. The second thing that I think is really important is, and really positive, is that at the state level, we've had some very good permitting reforms on siting. New York, California, Illinois have all had very important reforms in the last 3 years. And New York specifically in 2020 created a new agency called the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. And there are 3 things I want to highlight about this agency called ORES. One is that they have exclusive jurisdiction over all of the big solar and onshore wind projects. So any project 25 megawatts or bigger. So say 250 acres of solar or 5 megawatt turbines, it goes straight to ORES. So the developers don't have to get county approval and town approval and DEC approval. They just go straight to ORES. A very streamlined process. Second thing I want to highlight is that the legislation gives the state agency the authority to set aside local restrictions that are unreasonably burdensome on a case-by-case basis. This is really important. And the third thing is that the statute actually imposes deadlines on the agency to act. So, once ORES determines that an application is complete, it has to make a final decision within 1 year for the normal applications, and then within 6 months if the project is proposed to be sited on brownfields. So that's just New York. California has similar legislation, but it's I think a big improvement, and we'll see how it plays out. But I think it'll increase the speed of renewable energy siting and also get better results in terms of getting better sited projects.
Matt, just to follow up on that, the ORES ability to strike down unreasonably burdensome local restrictions, are there any examples of what they've considered to be unreasonably burdensome, or like what's been preempted under that authority?
Yeah, so the standard is that they can strike down a restriction that's unreasonably burdensome in light of the environmental benefits of the project and the state's climate change obligations under the CLCPA. And I'm not sure what specifically they've set aside so far, but I think the kind of thing that they would set aside are the types of restrictions that we see in a lot of other states. Like in many states in the Midwest, there are now local ordinances that prohibit solar on agricultural land. There's a town in Michigan, for example, that allows solar only in the industrial district. And the industrial district is 87 acres out of 19,000 acres in the town. So, less than 1%. So that's the type of thing that ORES would set aside. But I should mention that the law does, require local consultation. And I don't think that they, I don't think that they take this responsibility lightly. I think that they'd rather not, set aside these local laws.
Great, thanks, Matt. So Camille, turning to you, your work focuses on issues related to securing a just transition as we decarbonize in response to climate change. I think that's a term we hear a lot, but maybe you could just tell us what that means in practice, what it looks like, and what your work around that entails.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We'll probably have to come up with better branding than just transition one day, but essentially the just transition movement is a partnership between labor and environmental justice organizations. They've worked in concert for a long time, but this is a more intentional move to figure out how we can transition jobs and economic production as we decarbonize. Historically, our country has not been great at transition, I guess I would say, and I think you need only look at the Rust Belt to see what happens when we transition without a plan and without any kind of replacement. We're in a unique position in New York in that we have large numbers of unionized workers who have really highly sought after and translatable skills that can be applied in other sectors or even applied in their current sector, but require just a little bit of retraining to be able to get there. I will direct the law clinic, which is primarily concerned with training new lawyers. And so a lot of what we're doing is helping students essentially learn how to be good advocates in the environmental justice space, but through a more proactive program and plan implementation kind of framework. And so this is about how do we, we've passed the CLCPA, for example, now how do we implement it in a way that's just for the communities that have experienced the most disproportionate burdens of environmental harm and of climate change, and who are at greatest risk going forward in terms of climate resilience. And so a lot of our work is focused on land use decision making, helping folks who are providing housing and who may have access or control over buildings to building renovation. And doing a lot with flooding and kind of waterfront issues as well. And then ideally one day we will get a client who is doing job training, because that is what we would like to do, is also kind of slot in and make funding more available for people. So one of the great things that the prior panelists have mentioned is that the federal government is investing very heavily for the first time in a long time in this area. And they have set asides that are significant for what we would call disadvantaged communities, which is a legal term of art for environmental justice communities. But many of those communities do not have the resources or the capacity to actually accept and implement the money that they have. So a lot of the kind of work that our clinic is doing is helping to build that capacity at a local and national level.
Thanks for that. And do you have any views on, when it comes to a just transition? You referenced like some of the federal programs, but are there other successes that you've seen in recent years, either that you've been involved in through your clinic, or that have happened on a state or national level?
Yeah, well, certainly. So I'm going to be very New York focused, because we tend to work with frontline communities. And then every now and again, you might get a California bias because that's where I'm from. Yeah, there's been some really important legislation and some administrative policymaking that's gone into effect. So we have the passage of the cumulative impacts bill, which I think has been huge. That happened in December. It was signed into law in January. Cumulative impacts analyses exist in other states, particularly California, but have not been used to the same degree in environmental planning. So this will be important to ensure that we are not kind of relocating the harms of climate programs and climate interventions. So a good example is that New York has a cap and trade program that it's going to try to, implement further. There's a lot of controversy about accounting for greenhouse gas emissions right now. But one of the things we saw in California's environmental justice groups like heavily opposed and sued to block cap and trade, primarily because carbon doesn't come by itself. When you're releasing carbon dioxide, you're also releasing a lot of other greenhouse gas emissions that tend to be pretty noxious and often very harmful to human health. And so the fear was that cap and trade would hyper concentrate where emissions happen in locations where there were already large numbers of low-income people of color who were already dealing with these like climate issues and with much worse air quality than the rest of the state. That seemed to be what happened. That kind of is what happened in effect, because California failed to kind of have an adequate framework to be able to deal with that, despite actually having cumulative impacts analysis on the board for a long time. So the hope, I think, in the New York context is that we can have a decarbonization plan that is more inclusive and that is more sensitive to the needs of these different communities, and that doesn't sacrifice folks in the short term for this long-term kind of diffuse benefit that's critical and necessary for everyone in the state. So that was really huge. We finally have scoping and implementation plans on the CLCPA and on local law 927. So that's great, because those are both on pause for the most part during COVID. But now we have deadlines, we have plans, we have buildings identified, including my building. So this will be exciting. And I think, what the previous folks said about energy is really going to be our biggest hurdle. So unlike sunnier states, we don't have the benefit of being able to harness solar year round in the same way. And so the kinds of interventions that need to be made to scale up renewable energy are going to be different than what we've seen in some of the cities that are further latitudinally in the South. And so I think there's a lot of promise there. The federal bills are really interesting because they are essentially trying to incentivize by any means possible through tax credits a great deal of investment in renewable energy, but also in personal energy in terms of like production of energy at the building level, which is important and has not really been exploited, I think, to its full advantage in New York, in part because certainly New York City, just has a ton of red tape. And so it's difficult for folks to make those kinds of adjustments without having to make other building code improvements, which renders local energy production much harder for them. I think what we'll see coming down the pipeline is probably a series of efforts to streamline that process in the building context as well, to make local law 97 more effective. 71% of New York City's emissions come from buildings. And most of that is coming from energy generation, particularly an energy use rather, and in particular, the use of fossil fuel related heating. I think going into summer, it'll also be interesting. We still have peaker plants in New York City, and those plants are extraordinarily harmful when they fire, and they fire in areas that have the highest ozone burdens already in the state. And so there's a lot of really good work, I think, to be done about thinking about how we create a more resilient grid. And certainly we have now these transmission lines that will help in part, but I think there's some good work to be done about how to do more local power generation when we can do it, acknowledging that there are times of year where it's just not going to be very, very successful.
Thanks for that, Camille. And I'll pose this question back to you, then I'll give Matt an opportunity to comment as well. But I think sometimes environmental justice and expedited permitting for renewables are kind of pitted against each other.
Yes.
In the sense that like process protections for vulnerable communities are seen as coming at the expense of rapid deployment of clean energy. Is that tension kind of inevitable and inherent, or are there ways that those values can each be pursued harmoniously?
Well, I think there's definitely ways that the values can be harmonized. I think the reason those issues have been in tension historically is because we don't have other good ways for environmental justice communities to be heard in the process or to make kind of interventions. So what ends up happening is when your best law is to slow the planning process, everyone's going to try to slow the planning process, whether the project is considered to be good or bad. So the transmission pipelines actually are, or the transmission lines rather, are a really great example of where there was tension with environmental justice communities, particularly indigenous communities, about where they were going to be sited, how they were going to be distributing power. You know, there's a good narrative and really realistic and fair criticism from other parts of the state, particularly upstate, about who bears the burden of having to source and move the energy versus who's benefiting, because New York is in a very different position as a city than it is to the rest of the state. So those things are in tension, but I think it's because we don't have good other tools for EJ communities to be heard. And so I think if we are able to create these kind of scoping plans and these other efforts to be more collaborative in our policy making, my hope is that we would get a better outcome on the end. Excuse me, sorry. That we would get a better outcome on the end. I'm always conflicted. I've been on both sides of the planning laws. And so, you know, I understand the frustration and desire for streamlining on the development side. But having only had that as my only tool when I was an environmental justice litigator, I would not want it to go away because it was an important and critical tool for advocacy. And sometimes it's the only way that communities are brought to the table. So a lot of the time when we do these kinds of development deals, they're already done before you enter the environmental review process. And communities are told that. They're told this is like a done deal. There's really nothing you can do. The governor and all these other people have been meeting and they've all decided this is what they, or the mayor, and this is what they want to do. Borough president knows, and like, this is just pro forma. I think if we actually had a more transparent process on these like big developments, and we actually had more community collaboration, we would probably have better outcomes. And we've seen certain projects go up on the micro level, like very small projects, kind of on the building to building level, where that kind of collaborative planning happened, and we did get a better outcome without litigation at the end. So I think it's just a mindset change, and that we need probably more avenues for community participation, and better acknowledgement of where we have done a lot of harm. I mean, we should just be mapping the harm ahead of time and including it when we do our analysis of cumulative impacts.
Matt, do you have any comments on this tension between protections and speed?
Yeah, so I guess I would just start by saying that, you know, with the new ORES process in New York specifically, I think the fact that there are, you know, deadlines and, you know, a more streamlined and efficient process doesn't, you know, necessarily mean that there will be, you know, less environmentally optimal results. I actually think that the process has been designed so that instead of sort of an open-ended state NEPA process. There are specific submissions about specific kinds of impacts that the developers have to make. So it's just become a lot more sort of structured, while also having time limits on decisions. If you look at what's happened in some other states, like Illinois is a different way of going at permitting reform. Instead of saying, that the state on a case-by-case basis will set aside, whatever the local governments do, it essentially has set guardrails. It said, these are the maximum types of restrictions that a county can establish. It'll say for wind, for example, you can't require that a turbine be set back more than 2.1 times turbine height from a property line. So like that's the kind of restriction. For solar, it'll say, no more than 50 feet from a property line, whereas some towns would say, 500. I think there is sort of a, there will always be a legitimate debate about, local control versus state control versus federal. I just think with climate change being a global problem, I think that sort of requires a higher level decision-making process. Certainly you wouldn't have like a homeowners association in charge of climate change strategy. So should it be counties, states, federal government? But I think in general, giving more power to states for climate change makes sense. But I think you have to be aware that states can also take things in the opposite direction. New York, California, Illinois, they've all had very positive permitting reforms. Ohio, at the state level, enacted a law in 2021 that took things in completely the opposite direction. So SB 52 allows counties to declare themselves off limits to wind and solar. So counties now have this is a state law that gives counties veto power. So counties can veto individual projects, and they can also issue these binding resolutions that say no large wind or solar projects in any of the unincorporated territories. And the counties are doing it. So there are at least 13 counties now in Ohio where it's impossible to build a wind or solar project. And this is a state law that facilitated this sort of local veto.
Thanks, Matt. Ben, since you've worked on some of these projects too, you're welcome to weigh in with your views on this debate. And also wanted to then pivot to talking about continuing challenges in this space around decarbonization. So would be curious to get your thoughts there too.
Yeah, I actually think a lot of these questions about deployment with legitimacy, deployment with speed actually are a lot of the main questions that I think we're going to be grappling with in the next decade. As someone who spent a long time working with an elected official, particularly an elected executive, I think there's something quite important about folks who are in executive leadership positions or in representative sort of elected official positions, really feeling the values that Camille was talking about of making sure that they feel like they are representing all of the people in their community and are working to right wrongs. And I think when it works best, you have elected officials who feel accountable to those communities, who are then able to move fast, incorporating those concerns without always feeling like we can't move until we've had, yet another scheduled meeting or even more conversations, or, you sort of have to like quickly, absorb all of these concerns and move and make a decision to sort of move things along. So, for example, I think our conversations with Hydro-Quebec and the Canadian government, like Mayor Bill de Blasio was really focused on these First Nations Indigenous questions, right? And it's something that it's interesting. When he was a staffer in the Dinkins administration, was actually tasked with receiving a First Nations delegation from Quebec to talk about the potential for developing a transmission line into the five boroughs. So this is an ambition that is multi-generational. And so when we were working with NYSERDA and Hydro-Quebec, it's a long and complicated history. There are many First Nation groups, all of which have different opinions on the role of Hydro-Quebec in development. There were lots of distinctions between the Cree, which had a pretty positive relationship with Hydro-Quebec, the Pessamit, who had a much more complicated relationship, and the Mohawk of Kahnawake, which are their region sort of straddles the boundary with Canada, and each of the sort of posture towards the deal was a little bit distinct in each of those different communities. So, probably the most positive dynamic was the Mohawk of Kahnawake actually became co-equity owners on the line itself, so actually own a piece of it, and so they very straightforwardly have a sort of upside benefit of as power gets sold off of the line, their community benefits directly. Some of the more complicated and a lot of the objections came from Pessamit groups, some of which weren't even officially recognized by the Canadian government, which is sort of another sort of complicated wrinkle. But we had lots of really long conversations, making sure that if there were any changes associated with any of these, the export of power, that the Pessamit groups had a process in place to make sure they were consulted in ways that they hadn't been historically, and making sure that they were could be brought into a process much more than ever before. Again, it's one of these dynamics where we were keenly aware that we weren't going to be able to solve hundreds of years of complicated Canadian government, state, federal, and First Nation relationships from sitting in New York City. Like, there's just so much we weren't able to do, but sort of leading with the values of making sure that these things are being addressed, meeting with people, but then moving quickly to make a decision. All the process in the world can't really substitute for an elected official who has power and feels accountability to the broadest possible set of folks.
Thanks for that, Ben. Camille, let me turn to you to talk about what you see as the continuing challenges around building a just transition.
Oh, there are so many. It's like, where do you start? I think ultimately what it comes down to is like a paradigm shift about how we think that projects are done and what happens when we put things together. So I think that there's a very intentional, thoughtful way that we could work towards decarbonizing the economy. And I think that there are a lot of people who are in that intentional, thoughtful space right now who are doing their best. Our legislature is uniquely sympathetic to those issues in a way that other states are not. And at the moment, these were considered like when you talked about a just transition, when I started as an attorney, people thought you were a wingnut. They were just like, that's really out there and not very realistic. And the fact that we're talking about this as mainstream policy now, or as a critical and credible policy amongst suites of policies, is a huge win in my book. Including, hearing it from the office of the president, which is probably the furthest this kind of concept has ever gained traction at the federal level. So in terms of things we could be doing, I think that, like Ben pointed out, a really important factor, which is that we have a deficit of democratic process and accountability for a lot of folks throughout the country. And so this kind of overlaps very nicely with ACS's activism, actually, and advocacy, in that if we have better democracy, ideally we will have better outcomes anyway. We'll have people who feel responsible to the people who elect them into office, and we'll have a consideration of decarbonization's effects on multiple sectors of the economy. There's no reason that a decarbonized transition or a transition towards decarbonization should result in structural poverty, the way that we have created structural poverty in prior transitions. So at this point, I think, we have nothing but opportunity. We can't really do much worse than we've already done in the country. So the downside is we've done it terribly for a long time. The pro side is there's a lot of room to go. I do think that the folks who are going to be carrying the torch are going to be states and progressive cities. We have this great federal infusion, but the reality is that the federal government has not really been in the business of kind of macro level economy building when it comes to these kind of big infrastructure projects that we're going to need to decarbonize, particularly in the energy sector. It's active, but it's kind of seeded the field. And so we get an infusion of cash every 5 to 10 years. We take it and run with it because it's not a lot of cash relative to the need, but it's more than we've ever seen before. And so I think, we have about 2 or 3 years to really try to leverage the money that's come down and put it to its best and most effective use. And I think that that can be done in a way that is like cooperatively managed, that has, you know, a political economy story that is from the grounds up, instead of it being kind of the purview of only very, you know, elite, very rich kind of folks who hold wealth anyway, making all the choices about how money is invested. So we have a really good opportunity for kind of cross-class advocacy that happens in a way that, you know, has a lot of winners. We can grow the pie, which is something we haven't been able to do for a while. That's very abstract, I understand, but I think that, like, if you ask me to actually go through every policy, I think would be helpful. It would take like days. So I would just say that I think we should be broadly supportive of efforts to move money where it matters the most to the communities that have historically not had it the most. And to, you know, really give credit to a kind of ground up inclusionary decision-making effort or policy kind of testing effort. We need to have alignment at the grass tops and the grassroots for this to like really work in a just way. And I think there's more of an appetite for it now than there has been historically. So I'm hopeful. I think we'll get there. We do need a ton more resources in this area, though, particularly legal resources. I will say there's not a lot of like, there's a lot of folks in firms who work on the clean energy side, but there's not a lot of people who work with small community-based organizations, tribes, et cetera, to help them move and implement money on their side. And we absolutely need lawyers to be working in that space, whether that's pro bono or professionally, because that's just a completely under-resourced sector of environmental advocacy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Camille, it sounds like we'll have to do a sequel to this to talk about just transition policies. Matt, how about on the permitting and deployment front? What do you see? And maybe we've talked about some of them already, but do you see any additional continuing challenges that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, we're at this point where developers want to build projects, you know, all over the country. There's huge pipelines in so many states. You know, in New York, I think ORES has 11 gigawatts in the pipeline. And the big question is just whether the projects are going to clear the permitting process, whether the developers are going to hang on, even if they're, you know, caught in lawsuits, you know, meritorious or not, for, you know, year after year, and then whether there's going to be enough transmission. You know, Ben talked a little bit about transmission earlier, but I think in some states like New York, where we now have a pretty efficient permitting process, there's not a very long track record because ORES is so new, but it seems to be pretty efficient. You know, what I'm hearing from industry is that the bottleneck is now interconnection and just, is there enough, you know, transmission? So I think we're going to be hearing a lot more at the federal level about, you know, permitting reforms, and, you know, we'll see what other kinds of stuff it's bundled with, you know, whether it's bundled with fossil fuel, you know, permitting reform or not. But there is right now the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, is in the middle of a rulemaking to try to figure out if it's going to use its backstop siting authority more liberally. So states are still primarily responsible for siting transmission, but FERC can step in under certain circumstances if states are, you know, not acting. So, you know, at the regulatory level, it's possible that FERC can get a little bit more active. But I think, you know, we'll need to keep an eye on bigger transmission-related permitting reforms.
And Matt, just for those who are maybe coming at this relatively new, when you talk about the bottleneck of interconnection, can you say a bit more about what that means and whether there are any kind of clear or obvious fixes or policy solutions to helping renewable energy connect to the grid faster?
Yeah, I don't know. I might, you know, ask Ben whether he has, you know, any thoughts on this, you know, specifically. I think with transmission, a couple challenges are that transmission projects face some of the same challenges as, you know, any, you know, big facility where, you know, people just local governments, you know, oppose them. So siting transmission itself is difficult. And the other tricky issue with transmission is cost sharing. I think, you know, often the, you know, when you interconnect to a new facility, you have to upgrade everything. And then there's this question of, you know, who pays for the upgrade, you know, and when does it happen? So it's, you know, both a cost issue and transmission siting issue. In terms of easy fixes, yeah, I'm just not sure. I think, maybe giving the federal government a little more power over these major, interstate transmission facilities would be a step in the right direction. But I'd be curious if Ben has other thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing I would say that sort of lurks behind a lot of these questions is sort of the different paths to decarbonization that sort of lie along a centralized to decentralized continuum. So a lot of what we're grappling with now is moving from an electricity generation system that was largely concentrated in a couple of major power plants, right? And so you have these natural gas plants, a nuclear energy facility in Indian Point, and a couple of upstate, hydropower dams, and that was your grid, right? And so if you shift from something where you have like 10 or 15 generating facilities to something where you have hundreds of different small and medium-sized renewable energy systems, you're shifting, and you have the regulatory structures that existed for this much more centralized world trying to jam in a bunch of smaller projects into the interconnection queue. You're going to have this incredible bottleneck. And I do think there's sort of this overlays with a pretty big technological question that I think different folks in the climate community have very different views on. So what is the role of certain types of advanced nuclear or deep geothermal projects that could genuinely exist at the site of existing coal facilities, where you sort of swap out the coal generator and dig a very deep hole for deep geothermal, or put in a small modular nuclear reactor where you have all of the grid facilities there. It's used to be a central place where there's lots of electricity being generated. You have a pre-existing unionized workforce that might be able to get trained on the new facility, versus a vision that is much more decentralized, that relies much more on solar, wind, and storage, which means many different owners of different sizes and many different developers and many different, a much more complicated, and some would say resilient, some would say fragile system, where you have all these different types of resources coming in at all different places. So, I think that there's different stories of that type happening in lots of different states and lots of different grids. But I think that's a big tension that I think is underlying a lot of these questions that folks will be grappling with in the next couple of decades.
Thanks, Ben. So we're nearing the last 12 minutes of our program, and for those who are tuning in, please do submit any questions you have through the Q&A function in your Zoom so we can answer them live. But Ben, let me stay with you. You referenced earlier that New York State just did some pretty big stuff on climate in the budget agreement. I was wondering if you could give us the highlights there. Looks like we may have lost Ben. Ben, I'll come back to you for that question. Camille, I actually wanted to follow up on something that you've referenced a couple times, which is the comparison to just transition work to the Rust Belt. And I've been thinking about this myself. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, which is a community that was devastated by globalization and deindustrialization. I've been thinking about still how that community is trying to restore itself. So in the decarbonization context, like, what are the lessons we should have learned, and how are you thinking about making that transition smoother, including for communities that depend on fossil fuels economically?
Yeah, it's really difficult. So before I moved out to New York, for a very long time, I was a rural attorney. And so one of the things that I think is unique, and Syracuse is not rural as far as cities go, but it's a beautiful city, but it is a small city, I would say. It has a couple anchor institutions which really helped it weather the loss of manufacturing and then the passage of NAFTA. But I grew up in a deindustrialized city also, but was in the Bay Area. So even though it deindustrialized and there was hyper poverty, there's also gentrification. So people are constantly moving into the area. One of the things that I think we really miss about these communities is that often they are mono economies for the most part. They're reliant on one industry, and that was partially how they failed. once that industry disappeared. So in the Rust Belt, that could be steel manufacturing, it could have been the manufacture of cars, it could be coal if you're in Appalachia, although coal, if you talk to folks in Appalachia, they know that coal is not the future and that it's been declining for a very long time. But we haven't really invested in assisting local communities with creating alternative economic markets. So there are pockets of resilience, and there's lots of really interesting economic development work that's happening at the grassroots level, but is not really represented necessarily as well at like the county or the state house level. And I think a lot of that is who pays for who to get elected to office, if that makes sense. So, you know, if you're in Iowa, agriculture is going to have an outsized say in what you do. And maybe this is me being a little abstract, but when I worked abroad in development, a lot of the issues that we see in developing nations or developing countries are really similar to what we see in these areas that have been economically reliant on only one extractive industry as the core of their work, whether that's prisons, energy creation, you know, agriculture, manufacturing. And I think there's a really excellent opportunity for us to really invest in kind of local economic development that's driven by folks who live and stay there, because they have a different investment in ensuring that their community comes around. One of the cool things about being a rural attorney was, after seeing years and years of what I would call a brain drain, where like, you know, your most capable folks who have the very rare shot of going to college don't come back, is we now see a lot of folks who are college educated or who have had the opportunity to gain additional kind of upward mobility, moving back into the communities that they came from to help reinvest and reignite economic activity that's different than just being kind of rotating around one area. So I think we're in a really unique position because we have the chance and the opportunity, we have the political will amongst the people who live within these communities to listen to them and to let them advance alternatives to what they're currently doing. So in West Virginia, you know, the sector that's growing the most is home healthcare and medicine. That's not going to be an industry that's going to disappear suddenly over time. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a very large and historic arts movement that's existed in that area. And there's a number of, you know, poets and writers and artists who are coming back. And so I think there's a much more rich conversation for communities like Syracuse, for communities like the rest who are in the Rust Belt, or even for communities like my own out in California, who have historically been kind of seen as throwaway communities, to be honest. I think, you know, politically, they were not treated as if they were serious once they lost economic capacity. And they've been overlooked for a really long time. And I think they're in a really interesting position to be able to regrow. So I think the Just Transition movement just helps build capacity and makes money available, frankly, to be able to invest in those kinds of opportunities. I don't know, it's cool to see, like, you know, cooperative worker co-ops that do solar installation in these like communities, or folks who are doing community gardens and community agriculture to address food deserts. Like, there's really good work that's been happening for quite some time, but now it's getting elevated in an important way, and hopefully we'll get the kind of legal support it needs as well to go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of local creativity is very exciting to see. Ben, I'll try you again. And so would love to hear the highlights coming out of the state budget, but also we have a question from the audience that I think might be good for you as well, which is from Fred, who asks, why not put major transmission lines along major highways, such as the Thruway? Sounds good in theory, but I suspect might not be so simple in practice. I'd love to get
yeah, no, I can take both of these. So, you know, I think that some of the highlights of the state legislative session that just, I shouldn't say this session ended, the budget process just ended, which is usually the main focus of a lot of legislative activity in New York. So three major things that I think got a lot of attention, and I certainly kept my eye on. One was just as we'd passed a law in New York City to require that the next generation of buildings be all electric buildings, that ambition was taken statewide. And so New York State became the first state to pass a law requiring that new buildings be electric buildings, some in 2025, 2028. I say it carefully because Washington State actually did it through regulations. And so if you talk to Washington State attorneys, they'll be like, we did it first. And so New York State says, well, we were the one who passed a law to do it. You just did it with your existing energy code authority. So, okay. So that's sort of one piece. Another is, I think it got a lot of headlines. It was a major focus of sort of the left-wing caucus in the legislature was this act called the Build Public Renewables Act, which would empower NYPA, the New York Power Authority, to build and operate renewable electricity generation in a way that they in recent years had not been doing. It's a little bit interesting. NYPA was a very early innovator in public power, and actually Robert Moses himself was deeply involved in the development of major hydroelectric dams on the St. Lawrence Seaway in northern New York, and actually was behind a lot of the development of the nuclear power plants that have recently closed. And so this is sort of NYPA getting back into the game in some respect with a real focus around wind and solar development in particular. There's also a lot of provisions in that requiring certain types of participation with community and labor partners, and some high quality labor language that I think they were very proud of, that they worked in partnership with some of the labor organizations in New York. The third is and maybe actually Camille might have some views on this also on the cap and invest. I don't mean to put Camille on the spot, but so out of this process that was called the Climate Action Councils, which came out of the Community Leadership and Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which passed in 2019, which was sort of the state's major climate law that set a bunch of major targets. There was this long stakeholder process called the Climate Action Councils, sort of putting details on how New York was going to get there, how we were going to hit these really ambitious emission reduction goals. One big recommendation out of that was, in order to finance a lot of these changes, to develop what they call a cap and invest program, which is, not so dissimilar from a cap and trade system in California. The notion being you would set limits on different areas of the economy, require some entity within those areas to pay, and then use those resources to invest in certain types of climate solutions. There's still a lot of decisions that need to be made on that, but this past legislative session, they sort of worked out the framework for the invest side of that equation. So gave colored in the lines a little bit more of where the resources would go, taking advantage of these disadvantaged community designations. That was a big regulatory process that a former colleague of mine, Adriana Espinoza, actually led. She used to work for New York City. Then they plucked her to run some of the state thinking on this. So those are the things that I think we've been keeping an eye on. And I was just talking with someone that we will need many state legislative budgets a lot like this one, at least as ambitious as this one in the coming decades, to sort of fill in all the gaps that are going to be needed. The question about siting along interstate highways is sort of a terrific perennial question of, I think as transmission developers look all across the landscape, thinking about what is the sort of Venn diagram of places where they can get access rights, places where they actually would be useful to build transmission lines, places where community opposition is, that you can work with communities in order to site these things, particularly on the throughway idea. I recently read something that this feels right, that like it sounds good in theory, but a lot of the access questions are quite complicated if you're running along a highway, and so you have the right of way, but there are all these other types of restrictions that get in the way. So everything is 10 times as complicated as it seems from afar, is one thing that I learned in government. And sometimes if something seems really obvious but it hasn't happened, there's probably a pretty good reason why it hasn't happened, because people have thought about it and batted it around. But obviously, I think the question of the next couple of decades will be, how far can we push, and where can we figure out ways to be creative about where we're siting things and moving things. So maybe it'll be along throughways. I think USDOT is thinking about this too. So
thanks, Ben. So we are just about at time, but I did want to close by asking I think Camille and Matt in particular. ACS is a network of attorneys. What can ACS members do who are interested in these issues to engage in this work? And it sounds like there might be roles for them to plug into your just transition work, Camille. So what can attorneys do to help?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, there's actually a lot of just straight transactional work that needs to happen. And so insofar as you have experience with like taxation, contract review, due diligence, drafting, land use review, I know that sounds like very boring, but all of that is stuff where we absolutely need people, and there hasn't historically been that kind of legal support in the public interest environmental space. It exists a little bit in community development, but still kind of under-resourced overall. So if you work in an organization that can provide those kinds of services, partner with folks who have good relationships. So find other lawyers who have good relationships with EJ groups, mostly because environmental justice groups are so oversubscribed that it's very difficult for them to manage like a ton of pro bono coming in all of a sudden. And if you are interested in this area of work, there's a growing kind of boutique legal market that is doing this kind of work. It's existed for a while in solar in particular, and wind, but is now expanding kind of more readily. And there's just a lot of opportunities to get involved. So I would say, if you are interested in community lawyering in particular, I think it's a great space. If you are not as interested in community lawyering, but are interested in the legal work, there's a lot of different organizations that can help set up the kind of pro bono relationships necessary to be able to support this work.
Matt, how about on the permitting side? Anything that lawyers can do to support RELB's work?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. If you're interested in helping RELB, just send me an email, matthew.eisenson@law.columbia.edu, and we can talk about it. We work with lawyers from law firms all the time, both on stuff in New York and outside. Whenever we do work outside of New York State, we need local counsel. And so if you're, admitted somewhere outside of New York, we could work together on a matter. So just
any particular high priority states, Matt?
Yeah, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio.
Great. And Ben, I'll give you the last word. Anything else that you would suggest for interested lawyers to do to support on climate issues in general?
I as someone who went from law school and then got much more involved on the executive branch and in the legislative side of things, I always encourage folks who are interested in that to look for opportunities there also. There's lots of non-contract, non-litigation work for lawyers to do in sort of policy and rulemaking and legislation that I think is really valuable too. And local government, I mean, it's great. Check out New York City government. It was a great place to work, and people in DC have fun, but there's lots of other folks doing really interesting and ambitious work at the state and local level too.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. I really, really loved this conversation. So thank you for joining, and thank you to everybody who attended or is watching the recording. Be sure to stay in touch with the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter. You can sign up for our emails at acslaw.org and follow us on Twitter. But thanks again for participating, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Joel. This is great. Nice to meet you, Matt. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, guys. Bye.